You're listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96, and we just heard from T.N. Providence. He just did he pitched for us. He pitched for us for Black Power 96. He pitched for himself, and we are on the line with Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Gerald Horne is a contributor to Diasporic music for couple of decades now, and he's a big supporter of the station and a big supporter of Diasporic music. And we wanted to ask him. We want to talk about, Mia Motley in Addis Ababa. But first, I wanted to ask him why people should support Diasporic music in particular, and Black Power 96 in general.
Well, the reasons are legion and obvious. Where else can you go to be exposed to a breath of fresh air, to be exposed to cutting edge music, not to mention cutting edge analysis of contemporary events, because the world is in a state of flux, as we shall detail shortly. A new world order is being birthed, and where else than Black Power 96 and Diasporic music should you go to get insight into these phenomenal developments?
And we wanted you to, I think Mia Motley was in Addis Ababa, I believe. Wasn't she in Addis Ababa recently?
That is correct. About a week ago, she gave a stirring address, and you can find it online. I suggest you listen to it. She was addressing the African Union Summit at their headquarters in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And she invoked what she called the spirit of Ottawa, referring to an 1890s battle wherein the Abyssinians or the Ethiopians repelled an invasion by potential Italian colonizers. Perhaps if she had a better speech writer or researcher, they would have mentioned what I'll mention in my forthcoming 2026 book, which is that a signal reason for the Italians being defeated at Ottawa in East Africa was because they were armed to the teeth by the Russians, who supplied them with machine guns and rifles and pistols because, as we've said many times on this program, they had a material incentive in beating back their antagonists to the West, which of course, that antagonism still exists in 2025 and is at the root of this new world order that we're about to discuss. But in any event, she mentioned something that we should underscore and underline. And let me say that she talked about a summit, face-to-face summit, taking place in September 2025 between leaders of her own CARICOM, the Caribbean community, Jamaica, Barbados, etc., and the African Union. They had a virtual summit a few years ago. They'll have a face-to-face summit in September. On the agenda will be reparations to descendants of enslaved Africans. But my message to Black communities on both sides of the US-Canadian border, and indeed into the Pan-Caribbean basin, is that you should get in touch with your union, your student union, your tenants union, and authorize a delegation to go to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in September. For the North American delegation, I think that on both sides of the border, we have a material interest in lobbying the delegates about initiating a sanctions regime against the Trump administration. Obviously, Canadians have a material interest in imposing sanctions against this tyrant who has threatened to snuff out Canadian national sovereignty. Obviously, Black people in the United States have an interest in beating back this Trump attack, which is seeking to throw obstacles in the path of equality by its demagogic attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I would also say that Canadians have a special role to play because there is a tendency in Canada more developed than on this side of the border, to be bilingual minimally in English and French, which could play a pivotal role in terms of lobbying delegates, for example, from the Democratic Republic of the Congo or the Sahel states, or Senegal, or Cote d'Ivoire, or Chad, to name just a few. So I'm going to be talking about this quite a bit in coming weeks. And let me also say that there's a further reason to go to Addis Ababa to lobby these delegates from the Caribbean and from Africa, which is that the Trump regime is about to deport tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of Haitians back to the island. It's going to increase and exacerbate tensions and strains in the Caribbean. There are about 5,000 Jamaicans who are slated to be deported, about 1,200 Guyanese from the United States, 1,200 from Trinidad and Tobago. Not only that, but with regard to immigration enforcement, the Trump regime is cooperating with neo-fascist elements, according to the February 12, 2025 edition of the New York Amsterdam News, the Black Weekly out of Harlem. So there are many reasons for those who are able and capable to circle September 2025 and make a beeline for the motherland, make a beeline for the continent of Africa.
You are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. I was fortunate enough to hear Mia Motley when I visited Barbados for my only time I've ever been there, and I heard her. I was privileged to hear her speak 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 times. She was in opposition at that time, and I must admit she is a powerful speaker and controversial right now, because I know Barbadians on both sides of the fence. Some people think she's the next thing. She was sent to God from Obatala or Shango, and there's other people that think she's a complete sellout. But I guess that's every situation is most countries are like that. Have you ever heard her speak, Dr. Horne?
Well, sure. As I said, I've never heard her speak face to face, but I heard her numerous times. She's spoken at the United Nations. Many of her speeches are online, for example. And whatever one's opinion of her as a personality, that should not be an excuse to avoid going to Addis Ababa to lobby CARICOM and the African Union. I know Black people they're always looking for excuse, preferably excuse that makes them appear to be radical for not doing something progressive. But don't use the excuse of distaste for Mia Motley to distract from this proposal that has just been sketched and outlined. Yes.
Melinda, you have some questions.
I guess you mentioned it, but maybe you could talk a little bit more about U.S. invasion of Canada.
Well, I've been monitoring CBC. And a few days ago, I heard this very erudite conversation with a leading Canadian military official. I believe he is retired, residing in Ontario. He did not think a U.S. invasion was likely, although he did not say it was impossible. He did say that Canadians should expect Venezuelan-type destabilization and sanctions and making the economy scream. As you know, your current prime minister, Mr. Trudeau, spoke on a hot mic about this a few days ago, where he suggested that Mr. Trump's speaking about Canada's the 51st state is real, that there is a lust in the Trump circle for the raw materials of Canada. We mentioned many times on this program how for decades, if not centuries, there's been an ambition by those in Washington to swallow Canada. And it's going to be very interesting to see how the Black community in Canada responds to these threats. Will they take the position that this has nothing to do with them, that whether or not Ottawa is ruling Canada or Washington is ruling Canada, it makes no difference? I guess they haven't studied the healthcare system in the United States, for example. I guess they haven't studied the lack of gun control in the United States, for example, and school shootings, for example. I guess they are not familiar with the putrid and rancid white supremacy that is probably more developed in the United States than anywhere on planet Earth. But in any event, it'll make for an interesting discussion and conversation going forward.
Dr. Horne, let me ask you this. What did you think about Trump's Black history, African American history speech? I mean, he brought up Tiger Woods and talked about Rosa Parks and talking about building these statues. What was that all about?
Well, it's hypocrisy because at the same time, as I said, he's trying to destroy diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm afraid to say, and I think I might have mentioned this previously, that some of our erstwhile liberal and social democratic friends are on board with the destruction of affirmative action, diversity, equity, inclusion, because they've turned the situation upside down from their point of view, from their wrong-headed point of view. Diversity, equity, and inclusion tends to blunt the class struggle. What they don't realize, because they don't understand settler colonialism, is that diversity, equity, and inclusion is designed to do an end run around class collaboration. I guess they're not familiar with the history of this country, whereby you've had unions that have had white-only clauses barring Black people in particular from membership in unions and seeking to diversify the workforce by putting pressure on the U.S. ruling class and upon employers in general has been a useful method to circumvent this class collaboration, this white supremacy. But in any case, speaking of that latter point, I would be remiss if I did not make mention of the German elections that are concluding as we speak. And the news is that the so-called Alternative for Germany party, which, to put it euphemistically, has flirted with neo-fascism and neo-Nazism, improved by 10 points in the polls today. And it'll be very interesting to see if they become a coalition partner of the Christian Democrats, the party of Angela Merkel, who got the most votes, dislodging the Social Democrats, one of the oldest political parties on the continent of Europe. The Linke, the left, they improved by about 4 or 5 points, which is good news. But in any case, it puts in bold relief the stirring, if not stunning, remarks of U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, which I think we mentioned last Sunday at the Munich Security Conference, where he was expected to speak about the alleged purported supposed threat emerging from Russia and China. Instead, he spoke about how the parties in Germany should make accommodations for the Alternative for Germany party, which is noted flirts with neo-fascism. As I might have mentioned before, but it's worth mentioning again, because in some ways, it's the symbol of this new order that we're entering. The organizer of the Munich Security Conference, when he followed J.D. Vance to the podium, instead of addressing J.D. Vance's remarks, he burst into tears. He was sobbing uncontrollably because he could not fathom how and why it is that the United States of America, supposed home of the free, supposed bastion of the rules-based international order, supposed center for liberal democracy, so-called, is counseling alliances with the party that flirts with neo-fascism. But not only that, a party that is quite hostile to the United States of America, which speaks of their country, Germany, being slaves to the United States of America. And this raises something that's quite intriguing, like many intriguing points, it's not part of the conversation in this country, because the conversation in this country, left, right, and center, is really poor when it comes to penetrating the mythology of the United States of America. But I think that in terms of unraveling why J.D. Vance would be backing an anti-Yankee party of the right is because since the U.S. Civil War, you've had the so-called Confederates who sought to overthrow the government so they could perpetuate enslavement of Africans forevermore. They have been hostile to the victors of the Civil War. And they have oftentimes contempt for the country that they're supposedly leading, even though supposedly they are staunch patriots. And so you see them express that contempt by electing a washed up wrestler like Jesse Ventura as governor of Minnesota a few years ago, a washed up B-movie actor like Arnold Schwarzenegger as governor of California a few years ago. And the denigration of the United States during his presidential campaign by Mr. Trump is of a piece of what I was discussing. So once again, the results of the German elections are rather sobering. It's a reflection of the fact that we're entering a new international situation. And let me also mention another point, which is worthy of putting on the table, which is that with Mr. Trump, in a sense, pulling the rug out from under the Western European nations with regard to this escapade, this debacle in Ukraine, and seeking to make peace with Russia, which was the news from this past week, you begin to glimpse the outlines of a new international situation, which involves not only brokering a deal with Russia in order to focus on China, but also something that many did not contemplate, which is looting the so-called allies, starting with Canada, but not ending with Canada. And that puts, once again, in bold relief the visits to Washington this week of French President Macron tomorrow, Prime Minister Starmer of UK on Thursday. But in some ways, these men, and perhaps their ruling elites, are the equivalent of dead men walking. They are on the chopping block. And let me put forward a hypothesis that is worthy of consideration, I think, which is that geostrategic analysts for decades, at least going back to the end of the 19th century, have talked about the so-called world island, that swath of territory stretching from China on the east to Spain and Portugal in the west. Already there are trains from China rumbling those thousands of miles through Russian territory into the Iberian Peninsula. And frankly, your grandchildren may live to see a day where the once mighty and proud Western Europeans who depopulated the Americas and enslaved Africans themselves will be neo-colonial appendages, particularly of China, if present trends continue.
Dr. Horne, let me ask you this question. The former head of state of Germany, at one point, didn't she open up the doors of Germany for African people? She wanted more African people. Like it had something to do. Well, I know it has something to do with, when imperialism needs workers, they open the doors to anybody that they can get. Am I correct in saying that Angela Merkel, at maybe about 10 years ago, she kind of called on the people from Africa to come to Germany? They could get free education on and up to the university, or is my memory failing me?
Well, they were mostly Syrians and Afghans, but certainly there were Africans. In fact, one of the striking things about Deutsche Welle, which is the German equivalent of Voice of America and Canadian Broadcasting and BBC, is the proliferation of Black male anchors and hosts. I've noticed that from monitoring Deutsche Welle. And certainly Germany, and particularly I would say Italy, which is resisting migration, they're facing a demographic crisis for various reasons. And yes, they do need labor from the South, but oftentimes racism prevents that migration from taking place. And of course, Angela Merkel did try to break the logjam. But particularly, we should say in all fairness, that Germany, to a degree, like the United States of America, is trying to court India with regard to resolving their demographic crisis. As you probably know, in the United States, a number of the leading corporations, including Alphabet, Google, including Microsoft, are headed by South Asian men because of the fact that India has contradictions with China in particular. India is seen as a kind of fair-haired boy, if I can use that term appropriately. And therefore, India is being courted by the United States, by Germany. The problem from their point of view, at least from the point of view of the certain Germans, is that India has a close relation with Russia, which goes back to independence in 1947 and is not willing to break that relationship, as Mr. Trump has discovered, given the fact that Prime Minister Modi visited Washington just a few days ago.
When you said, boy, I thought about Marvin Gaye and Barry White. He said that, not Barry White, Barry Gordy. He said that Barry Gordy told him, be a good boy. And Marvin said, boy, you sound just like the white man, referring to me as a boy. So I'm throwing that in as a side. Have another question, Melinda?
Yeah, you mentioned Stormer and Macron in D.C. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Well, they're in a real crisis. I mean, they're in a crisis because the rug has been pulled out from under them. Now, it's interesting. They're selling all these wolf tickets about continuing to supply the Kiev regime, even if the United States pulls out. But as a number of documentaries have pointed out, the British military is a shambles, for example. That is to say, there are more horses in the British military than tanks, for example. And as for France, they're not called by right-wing Yankees as having a military comprised of cheese-eating surrender monkeys. They're not insulted that way by accident. And in fact, France has offered to send troops to Greenland to beat back a U.S. invasion of this Danish colonial possession. And although it has not been bruited formally, it would not surprise me if Mr. Trudeau, during his jaunts to Western Europe, might have gotten an agreement from France to send French troops to Quebec to bolster the Canadian military in case there is a U.S. military invasion of Canada. And of course, if you've heard any confirmation of that, you can share it with the audience.
I had not heard that from any official government officials, but I heard some of my European comrades mention the fact that should be that should be the case. I've heard that, yeah. But like I haven't heard Doug Ford or what's his name, or Bob Ray. I think Bob Ray is still in the United Nations. Or even Jagmeet Singh. I haven't heard him say any. Have you heard Jagmeet Singh make any comments like that, Melinda?
Does he make any comments? No, I haven't heard him at all. Yeah. We have like a few things on the deck that maybe we could put them together. With the Ecuador elections, the ICC sanctions, and the summit that's in Honduras?
Well, first of all, Ecuador, a country which has sent some of its most hardworking and talented sons and daughters to the United States to labor, particularly interestingly enough to Connecticut, particularly to New Haven, Connecticut. They had elections where the legatee of a billionaire banana fortune, speaking of Mr. Noboa, his majority was reduced, and therefore there will be a runoff with a candidate of the left who was quite close to former Ecuadorian leader, Mr. Correa. So we'll keep an eye on that. This is part, once again, of this resurgence of the pink tide, as it has been described in South America, including Venezuela, including Colombia, including Brazil, which, as you know, we had further revelations about the plot to prevent President Lula from returning to office, a plot engineered by the conservative crony and comrade of Mr. Trump, speaking of Mr. Bolsonaro, who apparently not only wanted to prevent Mr. Lula da Silva from returning to office, but wanted to poison him, believe it or not. And I would be remiss if I failed to mention that as we speak, unfolding in the state of Maryland is the so-called Conservative Political Action Conference. And what's remarkable about that conference is that it's an international conference. The son of Bolsonaro is there. Liz Truss, a former prime minister of Great Britain, is there. Nigel Farage, perhaps an incoming British prime minister, is there. You have various leaders of the French right who are there. And intriguingly enough, one of the leaders of the French right was repulsed and repelled when Trump advisor Steve Bannon gave a fascist salute a la Elon Musk a few weeks ago. This is something that the propagandists of the United States, the liberals, have not prepared us for. That is to say, the United States itself leading a global neo-fascist movement. It puts, once again, into the spotlight the dearth of internationalism exhibited by too many on the left and in the Black liberation movement too, I might add. And speaking of the latter, allow me to reiterate, September 2025, face-to-face summit in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, involving the Caribbean community, Jamaica, Barbados et al., and the 4 plus independent sovereign African nations, reparations being on the agenda. Although if our friends from North America show up en masse, which I expect that they will do, they will place on the agenda putting sanctions against the Trump regime because of the reign of police terror, because of these mass deportations of folk back to the Caribbean, including tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Haitians. This is something that we must contemplate because the right has internationalized the struggle. And they are doing this even though in the United States, they hold the reins of power. If their opposition does not act likewise, I'm afraid to say that we'll have a lot to discuss in the concentration camps.
And one more time, could you tell us why people should support diasporic music in particular and Black Power 96 in general?
Well, I think the reasons are obvious. This is where you come to receive cutting edge analyses and observations of pressing events. For example, where else can you get a cutting edge analysis of this new world order that will have monumental domestic consequence? Where else can you have an analysis of what could ensue if Mr. Trump and his minions decide to invade Canada militarily, not to mention minimally slap Venezuelan type sanctions on this northern neighbor? Where else can you go to hear cutting edge music and analyses of same? Where else but diasporic music and Black Power 96?
Thank you, sir. And I would like to say that we stand in the in support of Africa, Africans, and all oppressed people. We're not narrow nationalists, and we're not Tshombeyites. We don't believe in the Katanga province. We support, like I said once again, Africa, Africans, and all oppressed people. And I'd like to thank Lisa Watson for technical business per usual. And Melinda Francis, you can take us home. You are listening to Diasporic Music. I'm Melinda. Well,
we state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.